Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Our guest today is Cindy Hunter Morgan. Cindy Hunter Morgan is the author of Harborless, a book of poems informed by Great Lakes shipwrecks, which was published by Wayne State University Press. It was a 2018 Michigan Notable Book and the winner of the 2017 Moveen Prize in Poetry. The Chapbook Apple season won the Midwest Writing Center's 2012 Chapbook Contest, and the Sultan, the Skater, the Bicycle Maker won the Ledge Press 2011 Poetry Chapbook Award. Cindy Hunter Morgan writes regularly for Murder Ballad Monday, a blog devoted to the exploration of the murder ballad tradition in folk and popular music. Her work has appeared in a variety of journals, including Tin House Online, Passages North, Salamander, Sugar House Review, The Pinch, and West Branch. She is a co-founder of Filmetry, a festival of film and poetry. For several years, Hunter Morgan taught poetry and literary arts at Michigan State University, and she now heads up communications for Michigan State University Libraries. And her new poetry collection, Far Company, will be released by Wayne State University Press in May 2022. Welcome, Cindy Hunter Morgan.
Thank you. It's great to be gathered here in our separate spaces and kitchens and studies.
Absolutely. So when and how did you discover your love of poetry? And when and how did you discover that you were a writer?
Well, from early on, I think we all are in some ways, because we are people in this world, and we're using words and sharing words, and that's what poetry is built from. So for me, I know it began early, and I knew it in my heart that it was in me a long time ago too. I mean, I remember writing haiku in 6th grade a lot for a particular English class, and it's a really short form, but I was aware then of trying to exploit that compression and do something more than just follow like a strict syllable count, right? That I was trying to embed that short form with something more than just the right number of syllables, that I was trying to share some kind of emotion in it too. So it started a long time ago, as I think it does for a lot of poets. And I'll also say it was born from a kind of solitude I enjoyed as a child. Larry Levis, a poet I admire very much, he grew up in California. His family had a large farm. And he spent his days on tractors. And so he had the solitude of that job on the tractor. And he loved that solitude. He was happy with it. And that for him is where poetry began. He would memorize poems and think about them as he drove the tractor. And he always said that life, that youth on the seat of a tractor, gave him the kind of solitude that is usually only afforded to kings and criminals, which I really love. And I've always felt really lucky for the solitude that I've had in my life. I was not an only child, and but I spent a lot of time in the apple orchard at my grandma and grandpa's, in the pasture there, in other woods, just wandering and exploring happily.
Well, congratulations on the new poetry collection, Far Company. What was the inspiration for this particular project?
Harborless was such a unified project, right? It's all the poems in Harborless are informed by Great Lakes shipwrecks. So almost every poem in that book, the title is formed from the name of a ship, the year it went down, and the body of water in which it went down. And so my challenge for that book was how I take something that is so tight thematically and kind of fan it apart and give it some air. And I knew that, the Sultan the Skater, the bicycle maker, that too was a very project-focused chapbook, really a pretty long chapbook, as chapbooks go too. So all of those poems were kind of constructed from the idea of somebody who might be defined by a kind of title or profession, the Sultan, the skater, the bicycle maker. And that was my entry point into those poems. And it was great to have that kind of prompt and fun to have that kind of unity for that too. But I knew that so much of what I appreciate about a poem that I connect with is just that moment of connection, right? And we find it hopefully in a poem that is part of a very project theme focus or not, but good poems are just good, solid poems, and we connect to them because there's a sense of surprise there. And I think we connect to them because we meet something that is both familiar and surprising simultaneously. We have this moment of recognition where we feel like, oh, wow, somebody else felt this same thing, and I'm finding it here. And yet I'm finding it in a way that feels completely original to me in my life. And yet somebody else has had this bizarrely similar original moment in their life, but I've never heard it articulated this way. I never knew that somebody else had this. And so we make those moments of connections. And I just wanted to make poems that do that. But that were also informed by my life and by my time here, which is shared time. And so hopefully, like the I in these poems, which is really me, and it's not always, the I is not always, the speaker of poems, not always the poet, but really we can assume they are here. But I really hope that I is, well, as Young Lee says, like the divine I, that I could be you, or you, or you, or somebody else. And that, that the poems fulfill a kind of expectation that they're addressing something very human, right? That, our experiences of grief and loneliness and nostalgia and longing for a place that's gone, or a place we can't locate anymore, or for a person that's gone. All of these things cross geographical boundaries, gender, politics, and they're old themes. So then the trick is, how do you make old themes? How do you do something new with old themes? And that's what poetry does, hopefully. We reuse old themes, but we come at them from new angles. And that's really what I wanted this to be. I wanted a project that honored my grandparents, my family, and the love that I felt for them and feel for them, the attachment I have to the land we shared for a while. I wanted a project that thought about that. So much of writing is thinking.
A lot of authors have released books in the last couple of years during the pandemic and mostly to virtual events. What does that look like? What does your launch look like right now? And what are your thoughts as we're starting to try to open up again? How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, well, it's complicated, right? It really is. I don't think there's any substitution for sharing a space together that is real, right? And it's not to say that our conversation isn't real, but I think we all agree that there's something different about the way that we're gathering here. You know, I've got 4 places at my kitchen table, and we could pull up an extra chair if we needed, but we don't need to. There's 4 of us. So that would feel a lot different if I stood up from my chair and said, "You want a cup of coffee? You want tea?" We feel it differently. So I miss that. And I miss being in a room with people and sharing that kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of charged atmosphere to a live event. And I appreciate that very much, and I miss it. And I will have some of it. I have a reading up in Marquette at the end of April with Lynn Domina, who teaches up at Northern. And I'm looking forward to it very much. I'm vaccinated, I'm boosted. I need to contemplate that second booster. And I need to think about my parents who are older and who I need to protect. So we juggle a lot when we make these decisions right now.
So, what impact did the pandemic have on your writing? And what do you most hope that readers will take away from this poetry collection in this time, in this era?
Well, I think it was a rich time in many ways for a lot of writers, because we had a kind of social pass to be isolated, and we were forced to be isolated. And for some, that was tremendously hard. But for those of us who depend on a certain kind of isolation to do the work that we do, there was this kind of social pass, right? And there was this time that we found or felt that was easier to find or feel because there were less distractions. Lots of things were canceled. And I think all kinds of people noticed that kind of time, right? More families were having dinner together at home. But I think a lot of writers, picked it up like, treasures on a scavenger hunt, picked up that time like little treasures on a scavenger hunt and put it in their little bag or basket and said, "This is mine, I'm taking it." And I certainly did that. I started a whole new project and really have mostly finished a whole new project. So in many ways, it was a rich and satisfying time. And I feel lucky to appreciate it for that. And I know that it was harder for others to find the deep pleasure of it. But I did find, I was lucky. I stayed healthy. I had a job that in an organization that worked really hard to protect people. It wasn't perfect. And the nature of some roles and some jobs meant that some people were at the university when others were working remotely. But I was able to work remotely. I felt lucky for that. And I did, I've been healthy. And so for me, just on a very personal level, there was a lot I appreciated about the experience.
The book itself is arranged into 3 sections. And what was the thinking about organizing the poems in that way? Was that an editorial decision that you made with your editor, or was it always your intention to organize the book that way?
Yeah, that was a decision I made. And I think it's a useful construction, but it's an imperfect construction. It's sort of organized a little bit chronologically. If you look at the first section, those poems are mostly centered in childhood or later adolescence or very young adulthood. And then the second section moves in a little bit to another stage of life. And the third section is a still later stage. And I said it's imperfect because there's a little bit of back and forth sometimes, or like, if you really knew my life, I suppose you could argue a little bit with me and say, well, but wouldn't this one come before that one? And I don't know, that imperfection is a little bit like life, because we take one step forward and two steps back, and two steps forward and three steps back. And we never really fully leave our childhood behind us, our youth behind us. It floats into our lives as adults. It's part of who we grow into. Who we grow into is defined in part by who we grow out of or away from. So the kind of intersectionality between those sections it feels right. It feels right.
The poems in this collection take fairly ordinary memories and sort of transform them into magical moments. Things like holding your mother's tube of lipstick, for example. What can you tell us about the process of mining those memories from childhood or young adulthood and turning them into poems? How does that work for you?
Oh, well, Emily Dickinson wrote in a letter, in one of her letters, I am out with lanterns looking for myself. And I just love that. And in some ways, in many of these poems, I was out with a lantern looking for myself. And I think we all do that. And you mentioned the poem with the lipstick, and how I really do think that old notion of no ideas but in things, it's really true for poetry. It really is. We use the objects of this world as a way into emotion, and we remember things by way of objects too. And that lipstick container is one of those sort of images. We all have these images that stick with us from childhood. And I think that lipstick container really stuck with me for a lot of reasons. One, it was an image that I think I would have remembered outside of that moment addressed in the poem, because my mom did not wear a lot of makeup. And there was something really elegant about those old gold metal. I don't know if they're still metal. I don't know if they're still elegant, but hers felt really elegant. And she didn't wear it, all day, every day. If we were going out somewhere, there were three things that she always wanted to do before she left the house, which was go to the bathroom, put lotion on, and put lipstick on. And so I have that sort of, there's a lot we learn about our parents as children. There's a lot we never know about them, but we know some of their habits, and that was certainly one of her habits. And that day when I finally got to carry that lipstick container in my pocket, it did feel like an amulet. It did feel like a kind of worry stone. I could put my hand in my pocket and feel the lipstick container, but then in feeling the lipstick container, I felt her. In the same way in the opening poem, Rainlight, when I'm playing with that old deck of cards with my grandma, that was a deck of cards that, her parents had. And so I had this weird knowledge, even then, of holding something they had held and thinking about those places where my fingers pressed the same spot their fingers had pressed. And I think when we find these moments of connection that tie us to people we never even had a chance to meet, it's part of what poetry does too. Did I answer both parts of that question? Was there a second part there that I missed?
I think you were fine. I am curious though, when you took the lantern out looking for yourself, what did you find?
Oh, lots of people. and then one person, right? Lots of people that make up the whole of me. Czesław Miłosz says something like the role of the poet is to understand that we are never one person or seldom one person, that we're always more than one person. And that's what I found. I found sometimes we want to think we're one person, right? But we have like different parts inside us. And I found and confronted some of those different parts. Yeah, and that's funny because there are some poems in here that I think, oh, yeah, I don't know, like probably rather not have my mom and dad read that poem. Should I just leave it out? But then what happens if we edit everything out? I think we need some of that. There's a lot of my grandma and grandpa in here, and my attachment to them, and my love for that land, and my love for the natural world. But there's more to me than that, right? I'm more complex than that, as we all are. And I think acknowledging some of that complexity is a poet's job. That's the work of poetry, is to embrace complexity and not necessarily simplify everything, but to acknowledge that complexity, which is the truth of who we are.
Well, I certainly loved getting to know your grandparents and your mom and your schoolmates and people you encountered throughout life as a result of these very interesting poetic conversations. They were very interesting and inspiring. In your poems, you also commune with a variety of past poets, people like Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and above all, W.S. Merwin. What can you tell us about the way your poetry converses with theirs and the extent to which those poets of the past inspired parts of this present collection?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that, because that feels like a really important part of this book and of the creation of this book. And I wanted to be really clear in those passages where I'm in conversation with Merwin and with others too. But I can't help but thinking of Auden, who wrote in his poem "In Memory of W.B. Yeats." He wrote, and I pulled this thread out of a much more solemn poem and trivialize it maybe just a little bit in the way I laugh about it. But he writes in that poem the words of them: "Dead men are modified in the guts of the living." That was a poem I had to memorize when I was in college. And and I think about that now a little bit, because those Merwin poems, I think there are about 14 of them in the book. And no, maybe there aren't 14. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, there are several. And the Merwin, the ones that are really, engaged with Merwin's work, I'm using his title and his first line as a way into my own work. And I love the way that process, it allows me to acknowledge really quite specifically how we are always in conversation with the poets and the poems that came before us. And we're in debt. I have a kind of gratitude for that work, which I read, which I studied, which I learned from. And this is a pretty like overt way of sharing that gratitude. And it was also really helpful, honestly, to decide like, okay, Merwin, let's hold hands. You give me this first line and then I'll make my own thing with it. And it freed me up in a certain kind of way. Richard Hugo writes about the importance of moving away from a triggering subject. So like you sit down and you think, I am going to write a poem about this man who broke my heart. And that's what my poem's going to be about. But if you sit down to write the poem about the man who broke your heart, the poem often doesn't work. You need to move away from that triggering subject to discover what must be discovered to make the poem a poem. There has to be that element of surprise. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So you find that surprise often, is what Hugo said, by moving away from your triggering subject. Well, in my case, I had like a first line, and I needed to both embrace the first line and then move away from it, and let everything else fall away so that what came after that first line is mine. So there's a little bit of that, moving away from the triggering line. And then a lot of appreciation for the way those first lines gave me a way into a new poem. It was a kind of prompt in a way. And it opened a door for me, right? And then I could walk through the door and turn around and wave to Merwin and say, thanks. And that's how it felt. I felt like he was, call it different things. He was holding my hand. He was opening a door and then letting me walk through it. But I feel a great kind of like sentimentality when I think about it, because I wish he was here so that I could say thanks.
We often want to meet our heroes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And speaking of wonderful things, the Filmetry Festival, which you co-founded with your colleague Pete Johnson at Michigan State University, it's an annual collaborative art making endeavor that pairs filmmakers with poets. How great is this? And you create exciting new pieces of work, adapting works of writing into audiovisual media, creating an experience. It's entirely new. So how did you come up with that concept, and how has the festival evolved over the years?
Well, I approached Pete with the idea because a couple of years before approaching him with the idea, I had been trying to make my own cinepoems, little films adapted from my own work. And I didn't, they were pretty bad. I just didn't have the tech skills. I had this vision in my head, and then I couldn't, I'd sit at the computer and think, well, I don't know how to do that. I really have no idea how to do that. But I think the concept is not just fun, but really meaningful. I think that it can be really helpful for poets to think about their own poems, like sort of cinematically, and to use cinema in service of poetry, and use it as a kind of way to think about structure or scaffolding. Image certainly is what the forms share in common. Image is central to both. But I also think it can be really useful for poets structurally when they think about okay, but how am I building my poem? To think about the use of stanzas, which stanzi in Latin is room. So this notion of moving from room to room when we're moving from stanza to stanza is really useful, I think. But then to think about okay, but how does that think about it? Think about holding a camera in your hand when you're writing your poem. Where are you pointing it? What are you asking your reader to look at? Where's the lens focused? And that can be useful. And then to think about like, all right, cinematically, what does it mean to move from room to room, from stanza to stanza? So I think it can be really useful for poets to think like a filmmaker. But then I also think when filmmakers take a poem and adapt it and turn it into something else, they really are turning it into something else. They're transforming it. And that can be wonderful just to watch, but it can be wonderful for the poet to see how their work has been made new and how it's transformed and what kind of decisions the filmmaker is making. You know, it's not always the right choice to give like the eye exactly what the ear has, or give the ear what the eye already has, like that symmetry of what is seen and what is heard. Sometimes it's more artful to disrupt that sort of linear pairing and do something entirely new, which is kind of like what poets do with metaphor. Like we take something over here that's like item A, and then we take like item Q or R or S in this world. We just take something else in the world that's never been like coupled with this thing. They've never been compared to each other. They've never been joined. And we bring them together and say, not just that this thing is like this thing, but that this thing is this thing. There's like this powerful assertion. It's very confident. And it allows a reader to see the world in a new way, which is part of the joy of being a reader. It's part of the fun of being a writer, but then it's part of the joy of being a reader too, is finding those moments of metaphor that you think, yeah, that is perfect. And those things have never been joined together before. And yet there's a great logic, right? It has to work. It has to make sense in some way, but it also has to feel like wildly surprising. And I think that happens a lot in filmmaking when filmmakers think about what image to share with a certain line of dialogue. So I think a lot of surprising things can come from this union of poetry and film. And I think that it can be a pleasure for anybody watching, but then it can be a really valuable thing, a really meaningful thing for those who are doing the work of joining those two art forms. So yeah, we started the festival. We had the first premiere in January of 2019. And then in 2020, we were set for our second premiere. And that year, we were using work from the anthology Respect, which Bookfest Windsor celebrated. ML Liebler and Jim Daniels, co-editors of that anthology. So we used that as the filmmakers were adapting poems from that anthology for the second year, but we had to go virtual for that. It worked really well. We just, this year, hopefully we'll be in person again. Again, I'm not sure if I forgot part of your question. You can go back and say, okay, but how about this other part? Answer that part too.
I think it sounds like a wonderful combination and one that's very near and dear to my heart. So now that Far Company is about to be released, what are you working on next? What's your next writing project?
Well, I've been working on this series of letters. They began with letters to Emily Dickinson, and some of those have been published in Passages North. And then I started writing to other people, Audubon, Noah Webster, Amelia Earhart, Duke Ellington, Edgar Allan Poe, Johnny Cash. So I've been writing to many different people because I love the epistolary form. I think that letters can do something really intimate. You can share a lot and reveal a lot and engage in a lot through the epistolary form. There's something about the form that facilitates all of that. It makes it possible. And so to read a letter is a form of eavesdropping. So I think there's a lot of pleasure there for a reader to feel like they're eavesdropping. And it's really fun to engage with these people who I never knew, who are gone, but to engage with them in a way that like circumvents chronology and history and locates us in some space that we share. You know, that in some way, what it makes real or possible is this idea that we are alive together and that we know each other with a certain kind of intimacy. So it's fun. It's really fun. So that's what I've been working on.
Wonderful. Well, would you like to read some of your work for our listeners?
I'd love to. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. Do you have a particular one that you want to hear, or do you want me to just pick something?
I'd love for you to just pick something.
Okay.
I mean, the clown costume lipstick poem is my favorite, but read whatever you want.
I'll read that one. I will read that one. And I have to hold up the cover of this book and shout out to Matthew Cusick, who I don't know, but he's the artist behind this work. And he has taken bits of maps, tiny, tiny pieces of maps, and torn them up and repieced them into a collage that makes its own new art. It's really beautiful. Amulet. That Halloween, I was a new girl. First day at a new school. I could have worn street clothes, been the girl nobody knew. But I went as a mute clown sewn from a bedsheet, faded stripes, ruffled collar. My mother made it and made my wig, red yarn stitched to a muslin bonnet. My mother, who took me to school, left me with a sack lunch and a tube of lipstick, Revlon's cherries in the snow, her only makeup. For the parade, she said, closing her palm over mine. I marched behind Cleopatra. Cleopatra, I thought that was her name. Necklace coiled like a snake, gold cape like a river. Plastic, store-bought, though I said nothing. Later, we had cupcakes and fruit punch, then bingo with bottle caps. At recess, I wandered like a fool, my hands in the pocket of my costume, until I made it through the gauntlet of jump ropes and swings into a grove of maples in the far corner of the playground, and pulled the lipstick tube out. Gold, shiny, hard as the shell of a scarab. My mother in front of the bathroom mirror before church. My mother in the grocery store, shoe store, fabric store. My mother released to me in wax and red dye. We need our mothers, and they can come to us in surprising ways. Would you like another one? Okay, I want to share a Merwin one for sure. Maybe Antique Sound. So this poem uses the title, Antique Sound, of a Merwin poem and the first line of a Merwin poem. And of all the Merwin poems in here, this one might be sort of in closest conversation with his. Antique Sound, after W.S. Merwin. There was an age when you played records made from shellac, and later there was another of vinyl. But these days I play topo maps, cut into 12-inch discs, glued together to form two sides. I've been playing one map of an old orchard over and over, listening to the music of blossoms and the sound of the eastern ridge where the orchard ended. When I flip the map, I can hear the crinkle of frost crystallizing below that ridge, the sound of the river beyond the orchard. On the steep slope above the river is a thicket of grapevines. And when the map spins fast enough, I can hear the tags on the collar of a beagle jingle. She's flushed a rabbit, and soon she'll appear, her ears bleeding from briars. I am close to being there. I am stretched out on the floor with my eyes closed, just like a teenager. But the album ends too soon, as the best records do. When this one wears out, as it will, I'll cut a thin cross-section from the stump of an old apple tree, and I will play the rings through cambium, sapwood, and heartwood until the needle finds the pith.
Cindy Hunter Morgan, thanks for being with us. The new poetry collection is called Far Company, and it's available from Wayne State University Press this spring. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for sharing your afternoon to talk about poetry. Stay well.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.